Forged secretly in mortuary archaeology's hottest furnace, it's Archaeodeath. Welcome everyone to yet another Archaeodeath interview, and we're continuing with what seems to be an unexpected and unpredictable Viking theme to these Archaeodeath interviews through the summer. But we've got another exciting Viking themed guest. If I don't know if he's Viking themed, but the theme is Viking themed. But Trix, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Hi, Archaeodeathlings. Yes, I am Trix Randerson. Sunday name and therefore published name is Mark Randerson, but I've been known as Trix or Trixie for that long that I very much doubt many people know my real name. And I am an archaeologist these days at an HER, the Historic Environment Record, but I am also these days heavily involved in research around the last 5 years or so around the Viking Great Army.
And this is really exciting territory because, of course, people will know the Thames and Hudson book of the Viking Great Army and the Making of England by Dawn Hadley and Julian Richards, followed up rapidly by Life in the, yes, it was, I just had to double check, Life in the Viking Great Army, which of course is co-authored by your good self, and we hope to get onto that topic in a little while. But before we do, can I ask the standard question I ask all my guests, is that how did you get into the mad world of archaeology and not get out? I mean, how did it all start off for you?
In terms of, I mean, I was the archetypical geeky kid that liked history. So in some ways, that's your route in. In terms of actually getting into archaeology, it was one of those happy mistakes that I didn't get the grades to do my first choice from my A-levels. And my first choice was not archaeology. I'd been, pressured by school and to a degree, a parental, not parents never sort of said you cannot do, but there was a clear weight of expectation. So I was going to be doing something far more languages based in Aberystwyth. And I was also on a course that would involve librarianship, and it would have been a disaster. I would not have stuck with it. But I can remember various careers evenings at school where they said, oh, well, you don't want to do archaeology, there's no money in it, which is absolutely true. But yeah, I'm not telling you or the viewers of this channel anything unusual when I say you do it because you have a passion for it. And the passion is what feeds it. And so, yes, what's the old line? Archaeology is a beautiful wife, but brings a poor dowry. It's a very old-fashioned way of saying it, but it's true. However, yes, I got into archaeology that way. It was a second choice on an UCA form, which is clearly what I actually needed to be doing. One of those grand, unhappy coincidences.
Well, I'm delighted that it worked out for you. Despite, yes, it's not one where not a line of work which leads to copious amounts of wealth and jewelry and riches and fast cars, but it does have its rewards in other ways. And I think it's very important that listeners do hear this, because while people give very different, there's similar themes, there are very different routes, and I think it's important we admit that we always have doubts, or sometimes we were going to do something else. And I've had many people who contribute to this channel who over the last 5 years have said things like, well, I spent 10 years as a cleaner and this, and then I'm 5 years doing this, or I didn't know what I was going to do at school, and as well as people who sort of just plow on straight into this and it just happens. But there's so many ways in, and that's really helpful. Thank you to share with people so they understand that it's not an easy way in. I wanted to ask, so for those who don't know, could you quickly, you may not want to dwell on it too much, I don't know, but HER, what is that? I mean, what's your day job in archaeology involve?
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, it's not everyone knows these things. So I was just
So this is the Historic Environment Record. Now these are a loose collection of bodies within most councils.
Yes.
Not all, not all. That hopefully will change because one of the things of the Levelling Up Bill, on the inclusion of the Levelling Up Bill, was a requirement for county historic environment records to be statutory. So that's a big change, and that's sometimes one of the things that surprises people, that county level oversight and protection and promotion of sort of the history and archaeology of a county isn't what previously wasn't statutory. It's just something that was done. And so my job is it's one of those dreadful acronyms. I am HERO.
I like
Historic
that.
Environment Record Officer. Yeah.
I hear the dramatic soundtrack. It sounds. It's very
I
good.
wish one would play when I came into the office, but it never does. So I am one of 3 for the council at North Yorkshire.
Fantastic.
And
so you're looking after it all, the record, the all of our sites and monuments, and
effectively,
brilliant.
yes, yeah, it is. So we don't take on the City of York, and we don't take on the moors and the dales. They have their own separate areas of oversight, separate offices that deal with that. But we are 3 of us effectively filling 2 roles, and keeping an eye over. We report to the county archaeologist, and we are keeping an eye on maintaining the records of the area, knowing what there is and where it is, what condition it is. We give advice for planning, and we get consulted for planning, and also keep an eye on planning lists for all the ones that we haven't been consulted on, because that happens. It's not nothing nefarious there. It's just they're big areas and there's a lot going on. Yes. And we try and promote the archaeology of the area in terms of good management of sites, in terms of trying to make a coherence of it all. We have oversight of all the archaeological excavations. We are the point of reference for what needs to be done. Is it being done? Is it being done right? Has it been published? And sometimes that last one can be the big heavy drop, as we both know. And we're also, I'm trying to get things going again in North Yorkshire, particularly. Budget cuts and COVID have meant that our own public outreach stuff is right down to the bone.
Exactly.
But I'm trying to get that going again. We are, in terms of any archaeological excavations or research done, we're the point of call for anyone in the county to come to and say, what is in this area? What have you got? And we maintain that record and keep that up to date. Yes. And we try and promote other stuff, but at the moment, keeping that up to date pretty much takes all our time.
But that's such an important long-term role, and I think it's not. I don't think that aspect is forgotten, but as you say, it's taken for granted, and people forget that it's not statutory. It hasn't historically been statutory, and yes, so that's really important that you flagged that up. Thank you. I was going to, so where does, obviously you've had a life. Well, obviously I happen to know you've had a lifelong passion for things early medieval and maybe a little bit Viking. But how did you get into doing actual research on the Great Heathen Army, as it's called? I mean, what is even that? But how did you? Before we get to that, how did you get into this?
Well, I was one of those students who dug throughout their undergraduate degree. I was supposed to do. You have a certain amount of weeks of field work you are required to do to graduate. My second year at York, I didn't do that with the university, but I got the credit because I was employed by the York Archaeological Trust to dig. Wow. A case of being in the right place at the right time, and I think just being enthusiastic. I found when I started doing archaeology, I found I had an aptitude for digging, and I loved it. those two things stand you very well together. And so I walked out of my last final, and one of my supervisors from the Archaeological Trust was standing outside saying, "Would you like a job?" So I went straight into that, and I did 30 years in the field.
Wow.
And I was I always kept up to date with what was going on in the early medieval period, particularly the Viking Age, and I'll come to my interest in that in a minute.
Yes. Yeah.
But in terms of what I was doing, I was just doing commercial field archaeology. Sometimes research. You and I first met on one of the last grand research digs, really, of those
That's true.
Beasts of a forgotten age these days, really, of these huge open areas.
That's no way to talk about Dominic like that. Sorry, no. Sorry. Just in joke there. Sorry, no, go on.
But
no, but it was an exceptional sized excavation, and it was.
Oh yes, it was. I mean, it was West Heslington, the last year of the West Heslington Parish project, run by, at that stage, Dominic Powsland, although Christina Houghton was still involved. Dominic Powsland is a legend within British archaeology.
Too true.
As much for his approach to things as it is for his personality, but he was very much fought to get this entire area, huge settlement and cemetery excavated. And it was at the point we were there, it was the last of those sort of great open area excavations, particularly of Anglo-Saxon settlements, the kind of thing that is, mucking and all those kind of sites that you talk about. West Heslington was the last of these, acres at a time open, up to 100 people living in tents on site.
It was special.
It was. They were experiences. But yes, I spent all that time. I did what we called the circuit for a while. I ended up in London because it was the time that the Jubilee Line extension and things like that were going on. So there was a lot of work going on in London. I then, moved around a bit. I ended up being with the dirt archaeology side of things in Durham, at Durham University, for 19 years. And then COVID.
Yeah.
And so obviously fieldwork comes crashing to a pause. And universities are scrabbling to make savings, and an offer came round of, would anybody like a sabbatical? If you would like to take a year out and then your job is still waiting later, go for it. Now, at the time, I'd just been to a couple of very, very exciting conferences. There'd been the 20th anniversary of the publication of Vikings in Scotland.
Yes.
Which was a fantastic, one of those events, whether it's an academic conference, anything, you can taste the enthusiasm in the air that something is happening here. And then I'd also been down to a one-day conference in York. There was a one-day conference on Anglian York. And there I'd got talking to Julian D. Richards, who was one of my professors when I was an undergrad. One of my lecturers when I was an undergrad. We were chatting. Within months, of course, this offer of, everything had gone to lockdown, fieldwork had finished, and this offer of a sabbatical, had come up. So I dropped Julian a line. At the time, one of my parents had passed, and I'd got a little bit of money that I thought I could do something with. And I'd always had this. I'd always said from the mid-90s, I'm going to go back and do a master's someday. 30 years later, I hadn't, because even though, as we said, it's not a great deal of money, that regular paycheck is a swine for being addictive.
It can be influential on one's decisions.
Very much so. And so I dropped Julian an email saying, I've got an offer as a sabbatical, so I could do a master's. I can fund myself. I have got a job to walk back to if I do this, which takes another layer of trouble and worry out of things. Is there anything, I'm still up to date with what's going on. Is there anything that you can think of? And within the hour, he'd phoned me back. And,
brilliant.
Said, yes, there is we need to do a comparative work on the Great Army, of two camps of the Great Army. This is Dawn Hadley and Julian D. Richards, and basically Julian said, neither of us have got time to do it, and I think you'd be the perfect person. So the moment happened again.
But why the early Middle Ages, Trix? What's so exciting about these centuries after Rome and before the Normans, or that kind of dare I say it, I'm going to dare, and you can punch me through the screen. The Dark Ages in traditional terms. I said it, but in popular parlance, it's seen as a bit of no one knows quite much about it, but I've always loved it. But what brought you to the early Middle Ages?
I honestly can't say it's anything of a particular element of academia or anything like that. It was just the period that spoke to me. I think that's almost, and I think this is something that I think to a degree we don't talk about this kind of stuff enough in academic archaeology. I can remember 15 years or so ago, I was doing a community dig in Weardale, and I took some of the students along, some of whom were archaeology department students and some of whom weren't. They just came along. And there was a couple of lasses there who were not the kind of people you'd have expected to be digging. Just not their particular thing, and they came looking very well presented, very clean clothes, and I was like, how's this going to go? And they were having a screamingly good time. All I could hear all day was them. They were working with two former Durham miners who were having a whale of a time with the, come on, pet, do you not know how to lift a bucket? What do they teach you in these? And one of them said to me at the end of the day, why don't you tell people how much fun this is?
And it is. You can't predict who's going to get into it. Even, it's really fun.
Absolutely. And yes, you can't predict who's going to get into it. But there is something. Sometimes there is a spark in a site, in a period, in something that that fires you up. I suspect. For me, well, it's not even a suspect. I know for me, there's an element of the early medieval having a connection with Tolkien. And I had a very good teacher who was allowed time or found time to talk to the kids about what they were enjoying reading. He was a great one for sort of defending kids reading things that they wanted to read that might have been seen as trashy.
Yes.
And so he would stick up for Tolkien. But he also used it as a way of feeding myself and the other sort of D&D geek crowd towards things like Beowulf. And I remember he gave us his own copy of Henry Treacy's and things like that. And he gave us his own copy of a version of the Volsung saga, written in very contemporary language and things. But these are things that fire you, and I just found it had a hook in me. I enjoyed it, and then I ended up, like I said, more by happenstance than design at York for my undergraduate, and that was at the time a very early medieval department. It had obviously Julian was already there, and he'd already written an English heritage guide to Viking Age England. In my first year in a very small department, Micklegate House, there was a certain Neil Price knocking around as one of the postgrads.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him, absolutely. There, obviously, it was Martin Carver running it, and there was an involvement with Sutton Hoo, Tanya Dickinson, who of course did a lot of work on Tanya, and the way the syllabus was designed at the time was they were very into this idea of again, smaller departments. You can do these things, you have more leeway. And so we were expected to do things like part of our finals were a public lecture. And part of our finals were leading, designing a seminar group and leading a seminar. And Tanya did hers. It was one entire term, seminars that the students were expected to research and lead. And this was all done on early Anglo-Saxon England. And again, it's one of these things where you just think, oh, this is interesting. This is getting me. I think there's other childhood things in there. I was chatting with someone just the other day about I had the Usborne Time Traveller's Guide, which was the James Graham Campbell written one of those. I can remember that very vividly. And all these bits and pieces, there's just this sort of sifting through of things that mean that it's a period that's always appealed to me. It appealed to me from sort of early days as an undergrad, and I stuck with it and always maintained that interest. I think the aspect running through to now, 30 years later, is that when I was an undergrad, Viking studies to a degree was a moribund subject. It had been racked by disputes that had all been caused by Sawyer's books of kings and Vikings and things, and had almost fought itself out as a discipline. There wasn't a lot going on, and it's one of these things that now it's one of the busiest areas in almost one of the busiest areas in British archaeology. There's so much happened, to a degree possibly because of how that generation fought those battles and fought themselves out, and people came in with fresh eyes. We can maybe pick this up in a bit.
I think that's a very good point. But
the interest stayed with me, and then the last 10 years has been fed and fed and fed. There's so much going on now. But yes, I think I don't really have any sort of great revelatory moment other than
but
it was a period that got its hook in me.
It's already, that's a really honest and clear statement. Thank you very much. I think, again, I won't deny that many other people who've been on my channel have admitted, yes, I was into Arthurian literature, or it's because I liked some TV show. And these are ways we get in. There's nothing low or bad about the fact that we're inspired as kids with fantasy and fiction and exploring sites and the ways to get our brains ticking over these subjects. That's fantastic. So when you had this opportunity to work with Julian on this project, what did you end up doing? And it all comes out in the Oxford University Press, just to plug it again, Life in the Great Heathen Army, Viking Great Army.
Viking Great Army. Yeah. So, I mean, I contacted Julian, like I said, have you got anything for me? He bounced straight back. And so at the time, there were two sites which he and Dawn wanted to compare. In terms of what we're looking at, there are 3 camp sites for the Great Army, which we're fairly solid that we know where they are, and there's a lot more work to do. There always is.
Sure. But
you have Torksey in Lincolnshire, which is where the army overwintered in 872-3. You then have Repton further down the Trent, where they stayed the next year, and Julian had previously dug there on this magnificently crazy site in terms of its history, Heath Wood. And then from what we now know to be a few years later, a site outside York, Aldwark, and which is at least where part of the Great Army goes to. There's a split in the force at Repton recorded in the common stock of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and at least some of them end up in Aldwark. And these two sites have very, very different histories. The two I was doing, Aldwark and Torksey, very, very different stories in terms of their identification. Torksey is one of the great successes of the germination and the development of the portable antiquities scheme, the detecting in the area by responsible detectorists fired off. I think there's by about 99, Kevin Leahy has notes in literature. Oh, there's a concentration of very Scandinavian things at Torksey. How strange. And eventually various people sort of liaising with detectorists, and it was the late and very, very great Mark Blackburn at the Fitzwilliam, who first said this site is the site of the Great Army. And so there's a long history of detecting and recording and plotting and managing all these finds into this big database, which is what Dawn and Julian were running. Aldwark, completely different story, effectively came to light because it had been nighthawked for years, and two detectorists had been working it and selling off the finds, and they reached a point when they found a collection of finds and began to get worried at the amount they were finding, so reported it. And it was Richard Hall at the Archaeological Trust who took over initially. And a long and convoluted story about sort of what was really there, how much has gone, what there is. But York Archaeological Trust have dug on there, and there was a British Museum publication in 2020 of the site, all hedged around with quite cloak and daggery language because of agreements with those two detectorists of it was a riverine site near York.
Yes, it was never allowed to be named, was it? Yeah, that was it.
Never allowed to be named, was published with a site plan but no location plan, and all these things. So it's sort of quite shorn of any kind of context. But effectively, Dawn and Julian had a copy of the catalogue from that site, but also because Julian has a history of working with detectorists, Dave Haldenby in particular, who has done an awful lot of work on Anglo-Saxon strap ends and pins. Julian had also got other finds that had come from the site which weren't in the 2020 catalogue. And basically what he wanted, what he and Dawn didn't have time to do, was he wanted a comparison of the two sites. What is there here? What is there? What's the same? What's different? Which is what I was supposed to do. I kind of did, but I wrote far more than I was intended to. So what had started out as an MRes became an MPhil, mainly as a way of trying to allow for my expanded word count.
Wow.
And I think, I know that they were both initially wanting quite, a quantitative analysis. They wanted just comparisons of volumes and numbers. And Julian had said, like I said, we'd kept in touch. And he said, well, you're the right guy for this because the finds, the kind of stuff that will come up. I've always had a passion for finds as articles. Maybe we'll talk about that later again. But also you've got, the field archaeologist's eye for working out which a bit, what's a bias in the recording, what has been missed, what has been sold off and not reported. So to be able to make that comparison, but make it with a more judgment rather than just purely, we have 12 coins here, but 3 coins here. Now, one of my old supervisors when I worked in London, Dougie Killock, always used to, although, you know, with commercial archaeology, you're up against a deadline, you're up against a budget, things. But his measure for digging a site properly was, have you done justice to the archaeology?
Yes.
I remember him saying that to me for 96, 97. And the phrase just stuck with me. You know, that's the measure you want to, if you're going to keep your enthusiasm and passion, if you're going to feel like you've done a good job, have you done justice to what is there? And I felt I couldn't do justice to what was there in terms of just producing that. So I ended up writing far too much, and getting very into the finds and very into what you could try and extrapolate from them or what they told you. And thus the middle section of that book,
yes,
is effectively my thesis, obviously edited and improved by Dawn and by Julian and knocked into a shape that is not as academic and without me going off on some of my flights of fancy and all various interpretations. It's a group effort, obviously, so interpretations are held by us all. But that's what I ended up producing. I dug into the finds, a metal detected assemblage, and I looked at what it could tell us between these two sites, which were occupied 2 to 3 years apart.
Such a precise chronology. That's what we need to emphasize for people. You know, we know, you know, I mean, correct me if I don't understand, but my understanding is that this is one of those rare occasions where we can pinpoint historical records to an archaeological site in the 9th century, in the late 9th century, and that you can't always do that. And you know, but here I think there's a great confidence we are looking at, in each case, a very short period. Am I misled?
Absolutely so. There are at Aldwark, there's a period of activity before they occupy the army occupies an earthwork, which looks to have already been abandoned by the time they take it over. They have just picked up on a usable site. And on both sites, there's a sort of a tail of low-level activity afterwards. There's little bits and pieces going on, but the overwhelming bulk of the activity and of our finds, thousands of finds, are from very precisely dated timeframes. It's Andy Woods, now at the Yorkshire Museum, did a very good analysis of this from looking at the coins.
Yeah,
because of course you have not only Anglo-Saxon broad pennies, but you've got dirham, and dirham are more precisely dated than Anglo-Saxon pennies. But when you smoosh that evidence together, you can say you've got a cut-off point here where all this activity just drops away. And so we can one of the things that fascinates me about the Great Army generally is there is a collection of finds which has been identified that go with the force, and then when you have all these elements of all these finds together, that's the Great Army, and that's one generation. And the ability to see one single generation, one snapshot of a decade or two at 1,000 years distance is an incredible thing. It doesn't really happen. But then to be able to say, this is the winter that all this stuff happened, that closely is a remarkable thing. It's not something that really ever happens.
And for those who aren't familiar, these Vikings aren't just sitting around all winter with very rubbish pockets that are spilling forth everything. This is clearly a low-level residue of accidental loss from a vast amount of gathered wealth and material culture that they're trading, they're raiding, they're extracting by threat and tribute, and they're hoarding there. And this is just that, it's like a festival field where everyone's gone, but where before pre-plastic. Again, I'm talking to the expert here. Correct me if I say anything wrong, but I'm just trying to think of ways of conveying it. You know, but you've got that low-level sort of detritus that people accidentally lose. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And you've hit on one of the analogies that we've used. Yeah, it's a festival. It's comparable to that you've got. I mean, it's very comparable to that because, of course, you've got two riverside locations being occupied by hundreds, if not thousands of people for a winter with mud and snow and rain and the churn of the ground, as well as all this material culture flying around the place. And so, yes, stuff must have gone into the festival style mud quite easily and been lost and just been churned over and churned around. Most of what we've got is quite small, but there are some quite big items that must have just, some areas, some busy areas of the camp must have just been a sea of mud for some of the months they were there.
Yeah. And so things are getting, so you got, right. So, I mean, without being too listy, we've got the coins, which are both, you got the silver imported caliphate coins of the dirhams and hacked up and they're being used. You've got the Anglo-Saxon coinage of different kinds. I've got a question, an expert question to come back to you at the end, a nerdy question to see if you about that. But you've also got all sorts of other stuff. What kind of other stuff are we finding from metal detecting of these sites?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, one of the other coins that comes up is the Northumbrian stiker, which are the little copper alloy, mainly brass coins. That's initially how Torksey was identified. It's because Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are very good at keeping out other people's coins. And there's no reason for a Northumbrian coin to be down in Lincolnshire. And it was one of the first finds that was identified. And somebody thought, something's going on here.
Yeah.
So you got coins out of place and dirham. I mean, the big overwhelming element that we find on all the sites is economic activity. Again, one of the things that fascinates me about this, because one of the things I will come on to, I'm sure, in the course of this, is that not only has the identification of these sites been because it had the confounded expectations of what there should be. The reason they were identified or taken so long to be seen is because archaeology had a very clear expectation of what a Viking camp would look like. And these sites didn't fit the model, so were not identified. But equally, within the camps themselves, the things that our popular imaginations think of as being Viking, they're not really there. And the big thing you can see is trading and economic activity. So coins, weights, lots of different types of weights. You get the just plain lead weights. You get the Great Army style weights, which is the inset weights, lead weights with bits of chopped up metalwork or glass or whatever set into the top. You get the little tiny cubo-octahedral weights, we call them, little like dice with the corners cut off. Which I
can never remember that without checking back to my literature. Cubo-octahedral. It's one of those words I can't. Sorry, I'm clearly not a nerdy.
It's sorry. I mean, to be honest, both the type. There's another type which we don't have because the date line is very slightly later. It's the oblate spheroid.
That's it. That's the other one. Yeah, you don't have those.
No. Well, I mean, this is work that was, again, something that ties in terms of our dating. It's work that was done at Birka. And the excavations there in the 90s established that these cubo-octahedral weights come in round about 860. But the oblate spheroids are just slightly later. They're a decade or so later. And so we have, by the time this stuff's all filtered across from the Baltic, and also when the Great Army lands, they are clearly using cubo-octahedral weights, but the oblate spheroids haven't really come into the general sphere of activity around the North Sea at that point, so we don't get those on the sites. Another little bit of quite geeky sifting of the data, but there's all these little pins and clues through it all. Lots of weights and lots of things to weigh. Metal, hack metal, vast amounts of hack metal, lots of silver, but also copper alloy and also gold. You've got bits of silver that have been chopped up, the classic hack metal, bits of jewelry, bits of coins in terms of the dirham and things like that. And these are chopped up as small change. They're weighed. Eventually, you'll end up with a big pile of them, which is then melted down and recast into an ingot. And that ingot is then progressively chopped up again, gets smaller again. And there's a big sort of circular motion of all how this metalwork is used. We've got lots and lots of things relating to that. Melted bits of silver and spills, ingots, pieces of ingot, hack silver. The same with copper alloy, which is a very interesting thing because there's this grand idea of silver as being the currency metal, but they're obviously trading in other bits and pieces.
Of course, yeah.
Gold.
You've got things that are clearly diagnostic of being, should we say, Northumbrian, Mercian, Anglo-Saxon in a general sense, that are being repurposed. And you've got the imported stuff, the silver dirhams, but you've also got bits of Irish metalwork and other bits and bobs showing that they're acquiring stuff from all over.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we were just chatting about the gold, and yes, that's one of the things that we think is playing in here. There's an uptick in the use of gold in late 9th century Britain, and one of the things again with doing this work on the Great Army is you kind of have a sift through things that have been said before and go, there's the pattern, and there's a lot of gold that turns up at the Great Army sites. They're clearly having a chance to go through church treasuries and other bits and pieces and loot stuff. Now at Torksey, there's a glut of gold. There has to be, because we've got this most remarkable thing just from that site: fake hack gold, where somebody has been making copper alloy ingots and then gilding them all. Get all faces, cutting them so it looks like someone's taken a chisel to it and then gilding that face. The same with bits of wire. And so at some point there's so much gold going around Torksey that someone tries to
fake it.
The only way you can make that work in a metal weight economy is by it being so common that it's not going to raise suspicion, but still so unfamiliar that you can make a forgery like that pass, because the weight's completely off. It's about a quarter of what it should be, which I find fascinating, and it gives you a glimpse into how rich these people were. There's a similar thing in Aldwark. There are what we call litharge cake. It's a disc of lead that comes from the process of cupellation, of purifying silver.
Right.
And they've clearly been doing a lot of it on that site, purifying silver. But on these lead discs, these lead cakes, there are globulates of silver still on the surface, visible to the naked eye, which have clearly just been, it's not worth picking that up. We've got enough silver. And so the wealth of these sites must be staggering. And yes, they're turning over church treasuries, they're turning over all kinds of places. They're looting things from the population at large. One of the things that you have in terms of this trade in copper alloy is this decorated insular metalwork. Insular metalwork is how we were describing it, because sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it's from.
No, exactly.
And also, it was an attempt to try to, this isn't just us, other people have done this, Cormac Bork, people like that, trying to not fall into that lazy labeling of, it's Irish. It's very easy to drop into that kind of thing. And it sort of robs the nuance out of what you're talking about.
Just hypothetically, some of it could be, I'm not saying for these sites, but hypothetically it could be, we'd use insular because it could be Pictish or Welsh or Cumbrian or, but we often just default into these. Same with Anglo-Saxon and Viking or Anglo-Scandinavian. I mean, all these terms have their baggage and their problems, don't they? But yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And, we were trying very much to present the army as the multifaceted composite force it was. And so if you start then applying these sort of labels too sloppily, you lose that thing. So insular metalwork, we've got bits of penannular brooch and pieces from reliquaries and lots of bits and pieces, Anglo-Saxon disc brooches chopped up. There are strap ends, lots and lots of strap ends, and then far fewer pinheads. And that's one of the other interesting things about the assemblage, that on a standard Anglo-Saxon settlement site, you'd expect to get roughly equal proportions of each. For the Great Army sites, it's about 4 strap ends to every pin. And this is clearly to do with the amount of metal they contain. That they are grabbing strap ends here, there, and everywhere to, melt down. And we've got them cut up at Torksey, cut up in very different ways, clearly deliberately fragmented, not just snapped or anything. So they're just like they're trimming little bits off silver to weigh, they're clearly trimming little bits off this metalwork.
So what had been perhaps for us as archaeologists, the diagnostic productive site of the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, pins, strap ends, here they're not just there because people are losing them, they're there because they're mass recycling them, extracting them, stripping them down. Yeah, that's amazing.
Absolutely, and it's this huge, there's clearly an industry in doing this. Now, just to jump onto something you said there, one of the sites that is tied in with the Great Army camps is Hadley up on the North Yorkshire Wolds.
Yes.
And that was dug by Julian. When I was an undergrad, I was there. But that's now been identified very clearly as a place where the Great Army visits in the settling of Northumbria, turning over these settlements, taking out the valuables, reorganizing it, reordering it for someone to take control of. But that was one of those classic productive sites, as they're called initially. So it was seen as a marketplace site. What you've actually got, this activity that was seen by metal detecting as a productive site, it's the Great Army coming through. So there's fascinating elements in that. The other element is in terms of the pins that they're liberating. There seems to be they seem to be very good at what they're doing. They know what they're looking for. One particular type of pin, biconical pins with a medial band, just descriptive thing.
Yeah,
they are heavily favoured in the assemblage, and if you look at Hinton's work from Southampton, they were identified in there as being made of brass, not bronze. All other pins are some kind of bronze, gunmetal, various things, but those particular type of pins are a very pure brass. And they've clearly identified that in the army, and so are going for those. We'll pick up more of those pins. The other ones aren't worth it, but if you see one of those, take that off someone. And you're almost left with this image of them processing captives or just the intimidated locals who are stuck around this camp over the winter and going, we'll have that strap end, we'll take that brooch, oh, you can keep that pin, I'm having that one. And systematically going over this stuff.
We're not creating a very romantic heroic Hollywood image of the Scandinavian. Well, it's not simply a raiding group. The whole idea is it's a massive composite of different, in a rough, loose alliance, almost like a pirate army, if you like. I know that Absolutely. Makes people wince when you use that analogy, but it's not a pleasant. You're finding traces of quite dark and part of of British history, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. I mean, one of the things that is obvious there is, well, why are all the dirhams there? And this ties in with the dirhams for slaves project. Why else are dirhams coming in? We have one dirham at Torksey. Like I said earlier, dirhams we have a very they can be dated quite closely, and so one dirham from Torksey is minted somewhere in modern day Azerbaijan, I believe, and gets to Torksey in as little as 4 years. So that's a fast flow of this Islamic silver coming into Torksey. What are they trading out? It almost has to be slaves, or it's going to be one of the big things which is coming out in exchange. And so, yes, this is not, it's like you say, it's not a romantic image, but I don't think it should be.
So this is we're seeing the Viking world is bound together by trade routes, and slavery is absolutely integral to them. And it's not necessarily, is it all, the idea is it's all flowing east, or it's a much more complex process. I can't keep up with all these the literature on this, but I'm intrigued by, is there a sense that we're looking at, yes, these objects are traveling so far because people are going back along that route to the east, or is everyone involved in trading and acquiring slaves for their own use, for labor and for other services?
I mean, to be honest, I'm not as up to date as I could be.
I'm not. No.
But I mean, I think there is an idea, certainly, that there must be a lot of short jumps.
Yes.
Certainly for an army overwintering, and there's been some fascinating work, mainly by Shane MacLeod, on looking at the logistics of keeping the army in the field, how to feed them, how to water them. Slaves are something you want to get rid of quite quickly. They're a drain. You want to convert them into finances. And so there must have been people who were quite happy to come and ship them away. But again, that's the same thing. You have to feed them, look after them, pass them on quickly. And so in terms of that kind of trade, probably lots of small steps, but there is still within that this clear contact with the east that you can see in both of the campsites I looked at. But that's another of these kind of, to a degree, I guess, unsavory. Oh no, sorry, that's the wrong way to put it. It is unsavory, but it's a degree of the things that the camps are telling us of the I think we get a far better picture of the reality of Vikings and a Viking army in the field. They are very heavily focused on economic activity, like I've been talking about. They are looting and extracting tribute and all other things that are going on. They are clearly drawing in people from all kinds of places. We have little bits and pieces that show evidence of other people coming along, or can be taken to show evidence of other people coming along. One of the main elements of this great army footprint I'm talking about, the assemblage that we associate with the camps, are lead gaming pieces.
Yes, I was going to ask about those. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So these occur at Torksey. We think they start off at Torksey, and they appear to be coming from the Roman villa on the site. They must have been just looting the lead off that. Now, the interesting thing is that these are one of the pieces that we can use to trace this generation. Nobody at any other time seems to make lead gaming pieces. And they're obviously not curated for a long time. You don't get them at Coppergate. Yeah. So they and I think there's a whole purpose of them being lead, that there's a mutability there. The same shapes we have as gaming pieces occur as lead weights. So there are all these, they're quite often termed in the literature bun-shaped weights, domed weights. And the only distinction we've really come up with between whether it's a weight or a gaming piece is whether it's hollow or not. So some of them are more like a little lead thimble, and that's a gaming piece. Whereas if it's a solid piece, that's a weight. But within that, you have these, one of the characteristic ones from the Torksey assemblage and elsewhere, are these, some of these ones, these little domes, have little crowns on, little points or globules around the top. And all the other gaming pieces we have, all their shapes agree with shapes of ones across the whole of Northwest Europe. They are just gaming pieces, apart from these, which are kind of a unique thing. And the only parallels we have with those are two glass gaming pieces from northern Britain. One from Dundale Hill Fort and one found quite recently at the excavations on Lindisfarne. And so the shape of the gaming pieces we're talking about, these lead gaming pieces with these crowns, as we're calling them, on top, seems to be deliberately echoing gaming pieces that would be recognized by Northern Britons, which wrongly suggests that within the Great Army, there are other things that suggest it as well, but within the Great Army, as active members of the force, you have Picts or Anglo-Saxons. Now, in some ways, that's not that surprising. Military service in the early medieval period is intensely personal. It's not done on, national lines. It's not done on any kind of cultural or ethnic lines. It's you form an agreement with someone. And if the Great Army takes York in 866, so by the time you get to Torksey 8 years later, well, if you were 6 years later, if you were a lad of 10, 12 in Northumbria when the Great Army took over, and perhaps your aristocratic family has fallen on harder times, then as the point they're heading down to start this journey down the Trent, going down from Torksey to Repton and taking over part of Mercia, you're of an age that you're looking to sign up with a leader. And raiding Mercia is what grandfather did anyway. So it doesn't matter if the leader is a Scandinavian, it's the thing that happens. And so I think
very well put, yeah.
It's one of these little things that, again, confounds our ideas of Vikings and Viking armies, that some of the people who are actively engaged in this force are British.
This is. I mean, you know this because we chatted about this when we met recently. But you say it makes sense, but the number of people who slip back into this idea, whether they get it from TV or just from their own imaginations, that there's some kind of ethnically pure Scandinavian force going, we look down on these, with a strange accent that sounds partly Australian and partly, but we look down on these Britons and these Anglo-Saxons. No, these were. But what we learn about this period is people incredibly fickle. What's the word for it? Their allegiances will shift with. It's like I'll always be an Anglian, but now I've got the silver in my pocket. I see things in a slightly different light.
Absolutely. I mean, equally, you can say with York, although the royal houses of Northumbria fall, the church manages to steer a course through the entirety of the Great Army taking over, and in fact, the Archbishop of York remains the same. No change there. I mean, some of that I think is because the leaders of the army are sensible people, and you might want to remove the old aristocracy, cut off that head, but the church is your bureaucracy, and they know who owes what taxes, and they have those records, and that you want to keep. But obviously people could happily come to an accommodation with this kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. And I wanted to ask, what other items do we have that speak of more personal life? You mentioned the gaming pieces. I mean, we have personal ornaments that were worn, amulets and things like that. I mean,
yes, there's been a few little amulets, and also some of the dress accessories, which are very, very interesting things.
Oh yeah.
There are little amulets. There are a couple of very strange ones, again in lead. And these are from Aldwark. We have they're often called Valkyrie figures.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Of the side-facing female gendered figures, often carrying weapons. This one is carrying a shield. Sometimes they are shown carrying horns as well. And these are a classic Scandinavian thing. And these, again, we've got one in lead. That's different. That's the difference from everyone else. We've also got this strange little piece of lead, two-sided flat piece of lead. We've only got a fragment of it remaining now, but it appears to show a beast, a wolf, swallowing a human figure and the beast has a sword put through its shoulder, and it's mirrored, not quite exactly on both sides.
Wow.
And the obvious comparison, the obvious analogy there is it's Fenris eating Othin at Ragnarok. But again, it's this. I haven't been able to trace any depiction like that, because it really is two legs sticking out of this creature's gullet.
I'm looking at it now, and it almost like, I could, it doesn't ring any bells. It's almost like someone's taken what they've seen elsewhere and just almost done what happens next,
Yeah.
And he's, do you know what I mean? It's sort of that's kind of, it's very strange.
It's a very strange little thing. Now, the great question is, are these comparatively common objects that we just happen to have from the camps?
Yes.
The accident of archaeological survival means these are here, or there's been a very interesting series of, there was a very good book a couple of years ago on Viking camps, and in that Leslie Abrahams was talking about the religious life of Viking armies, and she made what I thought was an incredibly perceptive point. But to be honest, she made a lot of perceptive points.
She has a habit of doing this.
She very much does. But she made the point that the majority of Scandinavians within this force, if they are, the people who have come from Scandinavia, they are severed from the landscape of their tradition, their your myths and your legends and your supernatural world is not there. And another friend of mine has said, one of the things you can say when the settlement happened is that they came into a Christian landscape where things are described in these terms. But Leslie Abrahams' point was that, once they stop moving, once this force stops moving, you start having to try and reach a point where you're bringing your traditions into this new area. And how does that play out? And I think with these two little lead things, we might be seeing something of that there. Things that they speak of very Scandinavian thoughts and beliefs, perhaps, but they're completely unprecedented anywhere in Scandinavia. And that really interests me. We've got a few items like that, which are, I think they show how quickly the army bedded into its new country. I think that within a very short space of time, what can only really be described as insular Scandinavian objects start being created. There is a series I was involved in, but not a co-author of, a paper that Dave Haldenby, Dawn and Julian did a couple of years ago, casting cultural identity in Viking Age Northumbria. And one of the things it looks at there is that after the army takes York, they start producing things very quickly. And there's a series of strap-ends, the Wupperton style strap-ends, it's named after the first find site, which are made in the Anglo-Saxon style, but they're very different from Anglo-Saxon strap-ends. Not only are they all repeats, they're all very, very close, so they're not an individually made item, they are cast, mass produced, but also the design on them is wrong, that it's one of these little Trewhiddle style artwork beasts. There are all these little crouching, growling, writhing animals, dogs maybe, that you see in Trewhiddle artwork, and on this style of strap end it's always the same one, clearly cast, but you have a beast which has another head coming out of one of its legs. So whoever's made it is copying a design but doesn't quite understand the rules. And so this is something produced by workshops set up by the Great Army. We think in York. We've got one of those at Torksey. So again, 6 years of campaigning, and there are people who are wearing an Anglo-Scandinavian dress accessory. Very quick incorporation of identities or expressing new identities. That's one of the things that I really thought of and latched onto with the finds at Aldwark. There was a series of belt fitting, strap fittings. I shouldn't be too certain there. Which you get at Aldwark. Now these are the technical term is an E3 strap end, but it's a tongue-shaped strap end, a piece of metal that goes on the end of a belt or a girdle, and they have a ridge down the center of them, this particular type. And there's a whole series of these at the camp, and associated slides for them as well, same style. The design is something which is copied from Carolingian metalwork. So it's not something you see in England beforehand. It's the army are introducing this, but also from what we know of English dress before the Great Army, they didn't seem to wear buckled belts. They were almost certainly wearing tied belts, which have two of these strap ends on. So you have the army producing these strap ends in the camp at Aldwark, and they are producing something that is all alike for them, this composite mixed force, as some were trying to put together a set of dress accessories that show they are all the same group, that also looks very, very different from what everyone else around them is wearing. Classic in-group, out-group gang marker, almost.
Yeah.
But also speaking of a previous host culture for a lot of the army. A lot of the army had been active in Francia before coming to England. And so you've got this sort of thread of a new identity suddenly goes bang at Aldwark, and this incorporation of different elements of the army's journeys being used as a way of signaling who they are in this new landscape, in this new area, saying, you know, we are these people, and also we're not you.
So do you think that we have evidence of a mainly male or all male group, or are we looking at is it difficult to tell from the fragments whether I mean, women may have been among the slaves or the servants, but were there women who were part of the military force in other ways, as wives, as merchants? I don't know. Is there any way of getting at that?
It's one of these ones where I think it's almost certain that they are.
Yeah.
But in terms of reading that from the assemblages that we have,
it's difficult.
You then get into the gendering of objects.
Yeah.
And that's a very tricky thing to work through. One of the things that I find interesting is the only 100% bang on, this is Scandinavian item we have from these two camps. The only one is a little button brooch, a little disc brooch with 3 Bora-style beast heads on. And these are seen as a female gender dress accessory.
Right.
They're found at Bjerke and Hadley and places, and they're seen in female gendered graves. And so the only thing you can say is that this is Scandinavian, this is made and brought from Scandinavia, is a female style one. There's a couple of pieces which might be trefoil brooch arms, one from each camp. But again, that starts getting complicated. This can be part of a strap distributor. It could be something else entirely. It doesn't have to be one use of these things. There are other bits and pieces which you can say, yes, there must have been women in the camp. Now, from our documentary records, from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, at Reading, it mentions that some of the wives and children of the army were captured. So they're clearly there.
Yeah.
And as we were saying, you know, whether they are slaves or hostages or there voluntarily, there must have been women within the camp. Now, a lot of the stuff that there's a lot of, not a lot, sorry. There is material which clearly talks to us that they are producing textiles on the site, on both sites. Spindle whorls, needles, teeth from heckles or from wool combs. I am quite uncomfortable with putting that as a female gendered activity. I think for a start, it's the kind of thing that people just did, especially if you are kids at the time, the spinning all the time, because various people who know more of this than I do have said you need about 5 spinners to supply 1 weaver. But also we're talking about a force with ships. And in the age of sail, find me a sailor who couldn't sew. So it's the kind of thing where classically, a few generations ago, this would have been seen in the world of archaeology as being a classic female activity. I'm always reminded, I'll digress a second, but I'm always reminded of one of the finds from the Osterberg ship, which is a workbox, which has in it, it's a fascinating collection of objects. It's a classic workbox of bits of junk, and there's a piece of chalk in it, and there's a box with some bits of thread, and one of the things inside it is the broken bit of the lock. The lock's been fixed with a broken nail. But the way this is written up in the Osterberg report is various items of feminine use. Yeah.
Of its time. So but likewise, we're always, as archaeologists, reading between the lines. You wouldn't say this is necessarily a peaceful force of freedom loving, happy, harmonious people just because there's only a few weapons. There's a few bits of sword and spear and arrowhead, they're there, but you have to read from that and assume that they're pretty equipped with weapons to do what they're doing. You can't, but you're not going to find that. They're not going to go, oh look, where's my sword gone? Oh, it's in the mud somewhere. I'm not going to bother picking that up. It's less likely to lose that, than Sorry, I'm just
and you've also got to deal with the fact that a lot of stuff is iron, and so not only is that a lower survival rate when you leave it in the ground for but also metal detected assemblages. Most detectorists will program their machines to edit out iron. They're not interested in finding it.
So there's such an exciting range of research on the artifacts that you've been studying from Torksey and Aldwark in the book Life in the Viking Great Army, plug again. But I wanted to ask next, Trix, where would you be going next with your research? What is perhaps a couple of the key things you think are still further research is required on this topic of late 9th century Scandinavian armies and their impact on the British landscape?
Well, there's a lot to do, and I think there's a lot that can come from this. There's so much we really haven't had time to touch on tonight. We've only got into a little bit of the what we call the footprint of the army. I think there's a lot more work that can be done there.
Right.
There has already been projects beginning to map the spread of the army across the landscape, looking at where they've gone after the camps, when part of the force that's at Aldwark decides to, the Chronicle says, they begin to plough and support themselves. Because obviously the other really fascinating element of the Great Army is we are seeing the point where Scandinavian raiding becomes Scandinavian settlement. As we've been talking about, you can see that in the camps, but obviously the camps spread and drift. But equally, the camps seem to be a spark that reignites urbanism in Britain. That you have this sort of desire for these very intense communal spaces that happens again. So towns are kick-started again by it. There's bits and pieces that are in the final third of the book looking at sort of pottery and things like that, which are all elements that come from the army. Now, for me, as someone who's interested in artifacts and what artifacts tell us, I think I want to chase some of those artifacts. There are things which are particular to the army, which I think could be looked at more. One of the classic examples, possibly the classic example, is the burial at Killoran Bay, the Hebridean burial, which is, it's our, for the British Isles, it's our great Viking burial. It's the classic things you want from that kind of thing. You have a boat and all these rich assemblage of artifacts. But within that, you have a set of weights. They're these inset weights, which we believe are born in the army. but there's a plain lead weight in there, which is this little domed piece of lead with 4 little upstanding points, and it's one of those Torksey gaming piece weights that we were talking about that were recognizable in northern Britain. And I think some of that interests me, of tracing these artifacts within the corpus of archaeology that we have. Where do the people from the army go? You can imagine that at some point the man who owned those weights is trading, and he puts that one on the table, and someone else in the crowd goes, okay, we can talk. Yes, you were there. I understand this. But the army has also managed to, and metal detecting has changed what we'd call the center of gravity for an awful lot of bits and pieces. For a while, Anglo-Scandinavian bells were seen as Norse bells. They were found in the Hebrides and Orkney, and metal detecting has shifted that center of gravity across to eastern England. The same now has been done for those E3 strap ends I was talking about, which are, rather than previously being seen as an Irish Sea artifact, you can now say, well, they're actually linked to the Great Army and the East. So tracing those networks as the army spreads, and particularly spreads west, is something that I'm interested in, because obviously another aspect we didn't really have time to get onto, such a broad topic. There's a section of the army, a contingent of the army clearly comes from Dublin.
Yeah.
But there are also things which drift back over westwards, especially after York is taken and held by the Great Army, that you get this sort of corridor moving through Britain. I'd like to trace some of the other objects. One of the things you can see in Aldwark is that there are, it's a small assemblage, but there are more items that you would think of as being from the Pictish areas and from Ireland. There are pieces of penannular brooch, there are ringed pins, there are all these bits that seem to tie into things like Dumbarton Rock and Strathclyde and what's going on there. And so I want to sort of pull some of those threads and see what that's going to tell us, that if you can spot this generation and this group of people, and you can do it by artifacts not only that they are carrying around with them, but they're creating, what happens with those artifacts? Where do they spread? Where do they go? What is the afterlife of that? And more for me, what does that tell us about identity and what they're trying to say about themselves when these Vikings stop being what we would think of as Vikings, when they stop campaigning and they stop fighting, and when they settle and become residents of this new area. One of the things we've touched on is how quickly they seem to bed into Britain, that they are perfectly happy to at least partially assimilate, but they are still coming up with ways of expressing their identity. And you get these very insular Scandinavian things. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in a lot of these aspects of how people are expressing who they are, particularly as we think a controlling force within a new land, and also the impact the army has on Anglo-Saxon England. There are changes in dress accessories, there are changes in ways that people are doing things that you can see from the impact of the army coming in. So I think it sounds like a big thing to do, chasing finds to do that, but these are the things that interest me from finds.
Absolutely.
And particularly with the people we think of as Vikings, like I said. And again, another thing we haven't had time to get onto, but so much in the camps confounds our ideas of what Viking armies can do. You said earlier that
yes.
There's not many weapons. There aren't. Torksey is completely undefended, and there's a handful of weapons. The point there is probably because you've got thousands of armed men. You don't need to defend the site. You don't need to make embankments and walls and things around it. but they must also have spread out across the landscape. And I'd like to find satellite camps. I'd like to find the bits and pieces around, because
they can't be just one location, can they? Yeah, sorry.
Absolutely not. They're not hedged in and hiding. They are dominating a landscape. They're holding markets, and the great line about, and they're controlling markets in the site. We see this in the Frankish Chronicles, that the Viking army says, "Oh, well, we'll leave, but can we hold a market first?" And the great line is, to hold a market, to control a market in the early medieval period, all you need is a local monopoly on violence. They clearly got the local monopoly on violence. But these satellite camps must exist around, and I'd love to trace them. I'd love to see what that does, and it shows how they are spread out into the communities where they overwintered, in the areas where they overwintered. There's so many things with places like Repton. That's a camp that seems to be spread across a vast amount of landscape.
Yeah.
And one of the things, again, one of the things I mentioned Heathwood earlier, the fact that there is a Scandinavian style cremation cemetery at Heathwood. Not only that is there, obviously part of the overwintering, but it was dug in the 1940s and everybody forgot it was there, which is just an incredible piece of one of these other bits. We could talk all night about how the very stumbling and confused route that has been gone to identify Viking camps in Britain and the Great Army in Britain.
Yeah. You'd think it'd be the first thing people would looking for would have found, but it's been it's a weird at one level. In 2025, we're having this conversation as if it's fresh news, because it is. I mean, in archaeological terms, only the last 40 years, and it's been a slow process. Well, 30 years. It's been a slow process during that. I remember still publications when I was a student where this was just a productive site, big blob on a map somewhere, South Lincolnshire or wherever it is, and now we're talking about this with confidence and detail. So it's a celebration of so much hard work done by metal detectorists, hobbyists, and professionals and academics all working together. I think it's a great
lovely
success
come together like that. And like I said earlier, you can then go back through a lot of the literature and start piecing things together that people have said, that you can see there's a style of ring which we can identify at the camps, which 15 years ago, James Graham Campbell had said, "Oh, I think that's a Great Army one." You can look at such sites as Flixborough or Brandon, and there's artifacts there, or a level of bits and pieces there. You say, "Oh, that's when the Great Army came through." There's a weight and a particular type of sword pommel and a couple of bits of hack silver, and you can see the course of this thing. So digging into some of those things, but I'm interested in what goes on with the settlement. I think historically an awful lot of weight is given to the Alfred Guthrum Treaty and the stuff that we have recorded in the common stock of the Chronicle, because that's what we have recorded. But there's far more interesting things going on in the north, to my mind, that don't get recorded. We forget that when the Alfred Guthrum Treaty is signed, it doesn't create this thing called the Danelaw. That's a later term anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's already two kingdoms, at least, which have been created from parts of the army breaking off and settling.
Yeah.
And they are then
a
complex thing. Beautifully complex, and they are spreading, making their own networks and connections. They're moving across a completely remade northern Britain. Like I mentioned Dumbarton earlier, but of course the kingdom of Strathclyde comes into existence because of the army. You've got the rump of Northumbria clinging on at Bamborough. There's a whole new map. There's a whole new series of things, and kings that we know from one coin at Cure and things like that. So there's so much to dig into, so much.
But this
as you can probably tell by the fact that I've happily gone on for as long as I have, and I could just talk the same amount.
But it's the joy and the challenge of archaeology and the responsibility of us to try and write this history from small things and to piece together the narratives from that would otherwise be completely hidden. Not everything's recorded in some hidden document. I know we know this, but every time I go online, people say, well, why don't we already know this from what some monk said? That's not the way this period works. We are building the stories from the ground up, from the artifact itself. And this project and your collaborators and you, just congratulations to all of them. I've met them at different points, most of them in different ways, but not everyone. But it's just great to see this book and all your work coming together. And I just think it's such a fascinating long-term parable. I'm so honoured to and pleased to be able to have a chance to talk with you in this context. It's been absolutely fascinating. And we'll put in the description links to the book, which people can purchase, and some of the other articles you mentioned, the York Archaeological Journal article by Haldenby et al. And various other things, and so people can follow up from this.
Yeah, and the final thing to note, and almost as it were the big thing I want to say, I've sort of walked around to this now, but you asked me what's to be done in terms of studying the Great Army from artefacts. The big thing that I was involved with, they're all sifting through these artefacts. The databases are publicly accessible. On the Archaeology Data Service, falling over my own words, the whole of the database of finds from Torksey, the whole of the database of finds from Aldwark are there to be dug into, pored over, photographs, descriptions. The lot is out there for people to look at. The book is an attempt to bridge that popular archaeology and archaeological report together. But the databases are the hard, raw data of what we found. Yeah. And that is there for anyone with an internet access to get into. And that's the thing that I'm interested in. What can other people find? What can people see? What can other people pick up as well? So I would encourage anyone who is watching this, go to the ADS and look for those databases and have a trawl through. It's a fascinating resource, and I'm particularly proud of all of these things, of the fact that is there, open for anybody to look at. I feel that's a grand thing to be involved in, and it's the bit I'm proudest of.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.